He had been speaking for some time. That was the trouble with Leander Holt, Duke of Kelford. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice or strike furniture or do any of the things that might have given Verity permission to flinch. He simply spoke, in the same measured cadence he used to address his steward about drainage, and expected the world to rearrange itself around his conclusions. They were in the morning room. It was 10:30. The fire had been laid but not yet lit, because Verity preferred the room cool until 11, and Mrs. Garrick had learned this within the first week and never required reminding. Outside, the February light lay flat and gray across the south lawn, and a single robin sat on the stone balustrade as though it had been placed there by a painter who understood composition. Leander stood beside the mantelpiece. He had not sat down. He had come in specifically for this. She understood that now. And he had positioned himself where the height of the room was behind him, where the marble gave him architecture. He was a man who used rooms well. She had noticed this about him early, in the first weeks of their marriage, when noticing things about him had still carried a faint, foolish warmth. "I have written to your father," he said. Verity's hand paused over her correspondence. She had been writing to her sister Constance in Hertfordshire, a letter about the roses along the east wall and whether the variety Constance had sent would survive Kelford's chalk soil. She did not look up. "I have informed him that the arrangement will be adjusted. You will remain here for the season. I shall take rooms at the house in Brook Street. It is better for both of us if we are not seen to be inseparable, when we are, in fact, nothing of the kind." She heard Grieve shift behind her. Grieve was her lady's maid, a steady, silent woman of 40 who had come with her from her father's house and who understood, with the precision of someone who dressed her every morning, exactly how much of Verity's composure was bone and how much was practiced. Grieve stood near the window with mending in her lap, and the shift was so small that only someone listening for it would have heard the creak of the chair. Leander continued. He explained, not unkindly, which was the worst part, that their marriage had served its purpose. The Campion land along the eastern boundary was now incorporated into the Kelford estate. The entail was secure. There was no heir yet, but there was time, and these things could be managed with occasional visits that need not be prolonged. He said this as though he were discussing crop rotation. He said it with the faint distaste of a man who had found a ledger out of balance and was correcting the entry. "I expect," he said, and here something in his voice shifted, not louder but pointed, as though he were pressing the nib of a pen into paper hard enough to leave an impression on the sheet beneath, "that any woman with feeling would find this distressing. I'm not unaware of that." He waited. Verity set down her pen. She looked at him, not up at him because she was seated, and he was standing, and the geometry of the room had been arranged to make her the smaller figure, but at him, directly, with the level attention she gave to everything that required an honest assessment. She had her mother's gray eyes. They were not beautiful eyes, particularly, but they were steady, and when they settled on something, they did not waver. She smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not triumphant or brittle or performed for the benefit of the woman mending by the window. It was a smile of genuine, quiet clarity, the expression of someone who has just been handed a piece of information and found it to be exactly what she expected, no more and no less. "You first, Your Grace," she said. 4 words. Leander heard them. He understood them. Not immediately, not in the first half-second when the sounds were still arranging themselves into meaning, but in the second that followed, when the silence in the room became the kind of silence that has weight. "You first. Show me feeling first. Crack first. Weep first. Be human first, and then perhaps I shall consider whether your expectations of me deserve the courtesy of a response." She picked up her pen and returned to her letter about roses. He did not leave the room. That was the thing Grieve noted afterward, not the words which she would carry with her for the rest of her life and produce, privately, like a coin rubbed smooth, whenever she needed reminding of what composure looked like when it was not armor, but architecture. What Grieve noted was that the Duke of Kelford, who had entered the morning room with a speech prepared and a position established and the full weight of his title arranged behind him like scenery, did not leave. He stood by the mantelpiece for 11 seconds. Grieve counted. Then he sat down in the chair opposite his wife, and he said nothing, and Verity said nothing, and the robin outside adjusted its position on the balustrade, and the morning continued as though nothing of any consequence had occurred. But something had. They had been married 8 months. Sir Rowan Campion had received the Duke of Kelford's offer with the bewildered gratitude of a man who has planted carrots and harvested sapphires. The Campions were good family, a baronetcy 3 generations deep, a respectable house in Hertfordshire, connections that were adequate if not luminous. Verity was the middle daughter of 3. She was not the beauty. That was Constance, the eldest, with copper hair and the ability to make any room feel as though the curtains had just been drawn back. She was not the wit. That was Patience, the youngest, who at 16 already argued with the curate about Greek and won. Verity was the one between, the one who managed the household accounts when their mother fell ill, who negotiated with the farrier when their father was in London, who could assess the yield of a wheat field by walking its edge and tell you within 10 bushels what it would produce. She was, in short, the kind of woman a man of business would recognize as invaluable, and a man of rank would overlook entirely. Leander had not overlooked her. He had assessed her. That was different and worse. The Campion land ran along the eastern boundary of the Kelford estate, and for 3 generations the stream that divided them had been a source of quiet legal irritation. Marriage resolved it. Verity came with 400 acres of good grazing land and a temperament unlikely to cause difficulty, and if Leander had noticed nothing else about her, not the steadiness of her hands when she poured tea, not the way she read a room the way other women read novels, not the fact that she had reorganized his still room within a fortnight of arriving, and Mrs. Garrick had wept with gratitude, that was because he had not been looking. He had not been cruel. This was important, and Verity understood it, and it was the thing that made his indifference so much harder to bear than cruelty would have been. A cruel man gives you something to push against. An indifferent man gives you nothing at all, just the smooth, featureless surface of someone who has already made his assessment and found the sum unremarkable. He ate breakfast in his study. He took dinner in the dining room when they had guests, and in his library when they did not. He spoke to her about the household with the courteous detachment of a landlord addressing a competent tenant, and when she entered a room he occupied, he did not leave, but he did not stay differently. She was furniture. She was well-maintained furniture. The first months had been the hardest, because she had not yet understood the shape of it. She had arrived at Kelford with the modest, sensible hope that a marriage begun in practicality might, with patience and proximity, develop into something warmer. She was not a romantic. Constance had inherited that from their mother, along with the copper hair. But she believed in the slow accretion of familiarity, in the way 2 people sharing a house and a table, and an occasional conversation about whether the south field should be turned to barley might, over time, build something that resembled companionship. By the 3rd month, she understood. By the 5th, she had stopped hoping. By the 8th, when he stood beside the mantelpiece and told her that any woman with feeling would find his pronouncement distressing. She had arrived at something her mother would not have recognized and her father could not have named, a state of self-possession so complete that his expectations of her emotional response struck her as genuinely, quietly absurd. "You first, Your Grace." She had not planned the words. That was what made them devastating. A planned retort can be admired and then set aside. A spontaneous one lodges in the body like a splinter and works its way deeper with every movement. Leander Holt sat in the chair opposite his wife for 20 minutes after she said them, and during that time he did not read, he did not speak, and he did not look away from the middle distance with any of the decisive authority that normally characterized his movements through the world. He was, for the first time in his adult life, at a loss. The days that followed were strange. Leander did not go to London. The letter to Sir Rowan Campion was never posted. He went to his study that afternoon and found it on the tray where his secretary had placed it for the morning collection. And he looked at it, and he put it in the second drawer of his desk, and he closed the drawer with the careful precision of a man handling something that might detonate. Verity noticed. She noticed everything. It was her particular gift, the one that made her invaluable for wheat yields and inconvenient for husbands. She noticed that he came to breakfast the following morning, not to his study, to the breakfast room, where she was eating toast with gooseberry preserves and reading a letter from Patience about a new translation of Herodotus. He sat down. He did not explain his presence. He asked Mrs. Garrick for coffee, and when Mrs. Garrick glanced at Verity with an expression that managed to convey bewilderment, hope, and a request for instructions simultaneously, Verity gave a fractional nod that meant, "Bring it, say nothing." He came to breakfast the next morning as well, and the one after. On the fourth morning, he said, "Your sister writes frequently." "She does." "The younger one." "Patience." "Yes." "What does she write about?" Verity considered this. She could have said, "None of your concern." She could have said, "You first." She could have wielded those 4 words like a blade every time he ventured a syllable, and part of her, the part that had lain awake in the first months listening to the silence of a house that did not want her, understood the appeal of that. Instead, she said, "Herodotus. She is attempting a fresh translation of Book 7 and disagrees with the standard reading of Thermopylae." She disagrees with Herodotus? She disagrees with everyone. It is her chief occupation. Something happened to his mouth. It was not a smile, not yet, not nearly, but it was the ghost of the muscular movement that precedes one, the way a landscape shifts before dawn when the light has not yet arrived, but the darkness has admitted it is coming. "An admirable quality," he said, "in moderation." "Patience does nothing in moderation," Verity said, and returned to her toast. These were small things. A woman less observant might not have noticed them, or might have noticed and assigned them no significance. A man coming to breakfast, a question about a sister, the faint tremor at the corner of a mouth. But Verity had spent 8 months studying the interior architecture of her husband's indifference, and she recognized, with the same precision she brought to wheat yields and stillroom inventories, that something in the structure had shifted. Not collapsed, not cracked, shifted, the way a wall shifts when the foundation beneath it settles into different ground. She did not trust it. She was not a fool. Mrs. Garrick trusted it. Mrs. Garrick, who had served 3 Dukes of Kelford and buried 2 of them, and understood the men of this family the way a gamekeeper understands grouse, their patterns, their flights, their tendency to startle at precisely the wrong moment, watched the Duke come to breakfast 4 mornings running and went down to the kitchen and told the cook to start making the French eggs he had liked as a boy. "He won't eat them," the cook said. "He will," Mrs. Garrick said. "He won't know why, but he will." Eves, the steward, noticed differently. Eves was a practical man, 30 years on the estate, numbers in his blood, no patience for drama that could not be expressed in a ledger. But when the Duke sought him out in the estate office and asked, in a tone that was studiedly casual and therefore announced its own significance, whether the Duchess had made any changes to the household accounts, Eves told him the truth. "She has reduced waste in the kitchen by 11%, Your Grace." She renegotiated the candle contract with Hewson and Son. Their price was 9 shillings above the Maidstone supplier, and she found the Maidstone supplier herself. She has reorganized the stillroom, restocked the linen cupboard, and resolved a dispute between 2 tenant families over water rights that I had been failing to settle for 18 months. Leander said nothing for a long time. "How did she settle the water dispute?" "She walked the boundary herself, Your Grace. Took measurements. Drew a map. Proposed a rotation that gave each family access on alternate days with a shared reservoir for Sundays. Both families agreed within the hour." "Both families?" "Both families." Mr. Cathcart said, and I quote, Your Grace, because I found it remarkable, that it was the first time anyone from the house had listened to him long enough to understand the problem. Leander left the estate office. He went to the library. He sat in the chair by the window where the afternoon light fell across the desk, and he stayed there for a very long time. And what he thought about was not drainage or candle contracts or water rights, but the expression on his wife's face when she had smiled at him in the morning room and said 4 words that had, with surgical precision, removed every piece of ground he had been standing on. She had not needed him to break. That was the thing. That was the unbearable, illuminating, quietly devastating thing. He had stood before her with his speech prepared and his position established and his expectation unexamined until that moment, unexamined because it had never needed to be, that she would respond as women responded, with tears, with pleading, with the kind of emotional display that would have allowed him to feel magnanimous in his cruelty or justified in his withdrawal. And she had smiled at him, not bitterly, not bravely, with genuine, settled clarity, as though he had handed her a bill she had already paid. He had married a woman who did not need him. He had spent 8 months failing to notice this, and now that he had noticed, the architecture of his entire self-regard was rearranging itself with the slow, grinding inevitability of tectonic movement. It was, he would think later, much later, years later, when the memory had softened into something he could hold without flinching, the most important moment of his life. March arrived. The crocuses came up along the south walk, purple and white, planted by Verity's instruction in the autumn, when she had still been making the house hers in the quiet, competent way that characterized everything she did. Leander saw them from his study window and realized he had not known she had planted anything. He began to pay attention. It was not a dramatic transformation. He was not that kind of man, and she would not have believed it if he had been. It was a series of small recalibrations, each one requiring more effort than the last, because paying attention to someone after 8 months of deliberate inattention is not a correction, but an education. And Leander Holt was discovering that the curriculum was vast. He learned that she took her tea with lemon, not milk. He had not known this. He learned that she walked the grounds every morning before breakfast regardless of weather, and that the boots she wore for this purpose were the same ones she had brought from Hertfordshire, resoled twice, because she considered it wasteful to buy new ones when the old ones functioned perfectly well. He learned that she read in the evenings, not novels which he might have expected and dismissed, but agricultural journals and estate reports, and once a treatise on soil composition that she had ordered from a bookseller in London without troubling him for the expense. He learned that the servants loved her. This was the detail that lodged deepest. Mrs. Garrick, who had served the family for 31 years, and who regarded new additions to the household with the guarded suspicion of a castle gatekeeper, spoke of the Duchess with a warmth that Leander had never heard her direct at any member of the family, himself included. The footman stood straighter when Verity entered a room. The kitchen maid, a shy girl of 17 who stammered around anyone with a title, had been heard chatting to the Duchess about her mother's receipt for damson jam with the easy confidence of someone speaking to a friend. Leander did not understand how she had done this. He had grown up in this house. He knew these people. He paid their wages, ensured their quarters were warm, remembered their names. But Verity had done something he had never thought to do. She had listened to them. She had asked the cook about her rheumatism and remembered the answer. She had noticed that one of the housemaids was struggling with her letters and arranged for the vicar's wife to give her Tuesday lessons. She had learned every name, every family connection, every small worry and private pride, and she had done it not because it was strategic, but because it was how she moved through the world, with attention, with care, with the steady assumption that people deserved to be known. It was this, not the 4 words, not the smile, not the devastating composure, that finally broke him. Not broke as in collapsed, but broke as in opened, the way a seed breaks when it has no choice but to grow. Lord Dacre came to dine in April. Dacre was Leander's oldest friend. They had been at school together, served together briefly in a minor diplomatic capacity, shared the easy familiarity of men who had known each other before rank and expectation had calcified their public selves. Dacre was observant in the way of men who have no ambition and therefore no reason to miss anything. And what he observed over dinner that evening was that the Duke of Kelford, who had spent the previous season describing his marriage as a satisfactory arrangement, could not stop looking at his wife. Verity was seated at the far end of the table. She was discussing the new planting scheme with Mr. Cathcart, the same tenant whose water dispute she had resolved, and she was doing so with a combination of practical knowledge and genuine interest that made the conversation sound less like a duchess performing charity and more like 2 people who cared about the same piece of ground discussing it honestly. She wore a cream silk evening gown with a high waist and long gloves, and her hair was dressed simply, and she was not, by the conventional standards of the ton, the most striking woman Dacre had ever seen. But there was something about the way she held attention, not demanding it, not performing for it, simply being so entirely herself, that the room arranged itself around her the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. "You are staring," Dacre said. "I am not. You are staring, and you are doing it badly, which is worse." Dacre took a sip of claret. "When did this happen?" "I have no idea what you mean. You look at her the way men look at things they have broken and are trying to work out how to mend." Leander set down his glass. For a moment the mask of the Duke of Kelford, which had served him so well for so many years that he had forgotten it was a mask at all, slipped, and Dacre saw beneath it the face of a man who was not angry, not proud, not distant, but afraid. "I think," Leander said very quietly, "that I have made a terrible mistake." "Then correct it." "I do not know how." "You might try telling her." "Telling her what precisely? That I spent 8 months treating her as though she were a clause in a contract? That I wrote to her father proposing we live apart? That she responded to this with 4 words and a smile that removed every assumption I have ever made about my own importance, and that I have not recovered my footing since?" "Yes," Dacre said. "That. Exactly that." But Leander did not tell her. Not yet. He was learning, slowly, clumsily, with the awkward determination of a man teaching himself a language he should have spoken from birth, that words were not what Verity required. She had heard his words. She had heard 8 months of them, the courteous detachment, the careful distance, the measured speeches about arrangement and purpose and practical management. Words were the currency he had used to keep her at arm's length, and she was not fool enough to trust them simply because their content had changed. What she required was different. What she required was presence, not the strategic positioning of a man who used rooms well, but the genuine, unperformed presence of a man who chose to be where she was because he wanted to be there. So he came to breakfast. Every morning. He walked the grounds with her when she would let him, and he learned the names of the things she had planted, and he did not pretend to understand soil composition, but he asked questions, and listened to the answers, and remembered them. He sat in the drawing room in the evenings while she read her agricultural journals, and he read beside her, not because he wanted to read, but because the silence between 2 people reading in the same room is a different kind of silence than the silence between 2 people ignoring each other, and he was learning to hear the difference. Verity watched him. She did not soften, not at first, not quickly. She had spent 8 months building a life that did not include him, and it was a good life, and she was not willing to dismantle it on the strength of a man coming to breakfast. But she watched him, and what she saw, with the same steady, undeceived attention she gave to everything, was not performance. It was effort. It was the clumsy, genuine effort of a man who had never needed to try at anything, and was discovering that the thing most worth trying at was the thing he had most completely failed. The Midsummer Assembly at Lord Faraday's estate arrived in June. It was the largest gathering of the county. Every family of standing within 30 miles attended, and it was understood, in the way these things are understood without ever being stated, that the Duke and Duchess of Kelford would attend together and present the image of a united house. Leander could have used it. He could have performed the attentive husband, the proud Duke, the public display of a reformed man for the benefit of an audience that would carry the story back to London within the week. Verity knew this. She dressed for the assembly with the careful attention she gave to all public appearances, and she expected nothing from the evening beyond the competent execution of a social duty. The assembly rooms were bright, 600 candles in the chandeliers she counted, and warm with the press of bodies and the sound of the orchestra tuning. Lady Faraday greeted them at the door with the effusive warmth of a hostess who understood that a duke in attendance raised the prestige of the entire evening, and for the first hour, Leander and Verity moved through the room separately as they always did, greeting acquaintances and fulfilling the obligations of their rank. It was Mrs. Whitford who began it. Mrs. Whitford was the wife of the local magistrate, a woman of firm opinions and limited discretion, who had, over the course of the season, made several remarks about the Duchess of Kelford that Verity had overheard and chosen not to acknowledge. They were not cruel remarks, exactly. They were the kind of remarks that women of Mrs. Whitford's position make about women of Verity's background, observations about breeding, about the difference between a baronet's daughter and a duke's wife, about the visible gap between a woman's station and her origins that no amount of silk or silver could quite bridge. "A competent housekeeper," Mrs. Whitford was saying to Lady Faraday, her voice pitched at the precise volume that ensured it would carry to anyone standing within 15 feet. "One cannot fault her industry, but a duchess ought to bring more to a house than efficiency." Verity heard her. She did not react. She was standing near the refreshment table with a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink, and she let the words pass over her the way water passes over stone, not because they did not touch her, but because she had decided, long ago, that the things other people said about her were their concern, not hers. Leander heard her too. He had been speaking with Lord Dacre near the windows. He was 20 feet away, perhaps 25. The room was loud. The orchestra had begun the first set, and there was no reason he should have heard Mrs. Whitford's remark above the general noise of 200 people enjoying themselves. But he heard it, perhaps because he had spent the last 3 months learning to pay attention to his wife, to the house, to the small sounds that carry meaning, and his attention, once engaged, did not easily let go. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried purpose of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to be deflected from it. And when he reached Verity, he did not speak to Mrs. Whitford, or acknowledge Lady Faraday, or address the small cluster of women who had been listening to the remark with the avid attention of spectators at a match. He held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said. It was not a request. It was not a performance. It was, Verity understood, standing there with her untouched ratafia and her steady gray eyes and the composure that had carried her through 8 months of indifference and 4 words that had changed everything. An answer. "You first, Your Grace." He was going first. She set down her glass. She took his hand. And when the Duke of Kelford led his wife onto the floor for the first dance, and did not release her hand when the music ended but kept her, through the second dance and the third, the room understood, in the wordless way that rooms understand these things, that something had changed between them that was not arrangement and not obligation and not the dutiful performance of a public marriage, but something else entirely. Mrs. Whitford said nothing further about housekeepers. They walked home that night. The carriage had been called, but the evening was warm and the moon was high, and Verity said she preferred to walk, and Leander dismissed the carriage without discussion. They walked through the lane that ran along the edge of the Kelford grounds, where the hedgerows were thick with dog roses, and the air smelled of cut hay and warm earth, and for a long time they said nothing at all. Then Leander said, "I heard what she said." "I know. You were not going to respond." "No." "Why not?" Verity considered this. The moon cast long shadows across the lane, and somewhere in the field beyond the hedge, a nightjar was calling. That strange, mechanical churring that sounds like a spinning wheel operated by a bird that has never seen one. "Because what she said was about her," Verity said, "not about me." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They stood in the lane with the moonlight between them and the nightjar singing its tuneless song, and Leander looked at his wife, really looked, not the assessing glance of a man evaluating an acquisition, not the careful observation of the last 3 months, but the unguarded, undefended look of a man who has finally understood that the woman he married is not the woman he thought he was marrying, and that the woman she actually is, practical, steady, luminous in her competence, devastating in her self-possession, is so far beyond what he deserved that the distance between them feels less like a gap and more like a grace. "I have been a fool," he said. "Yes," she said, "you are not going to soften that." "No." "Good." He paused. The word came hard, because he was a duke, and dukes do not admit to the things he was about to admit, and the title and the house and the land and the seat in the House of Lords and the generations of expectation that sat on his shoulders, like marble, all conspired to make vulnerability feel like treason. But he said it. "I do not want to live in Brook Street. I do not want separate seasons. I do not want to manage this marriage with occasional visits. I want—" He stopped. The sentence had run out of road. "I want to deserve what I have." "That," Verity said, "would be a start." She took his arm. They walked the rest of the way home, and when they reached the house, the candles in the morning room were still lit, Mrs. Garrick's doing, because Mrs. Garrick understood that some evenings require a warm room and a pot of tea, and the quiet, unhurried company of 2 people who are learning, slowly and imperfectly and with enormous care, how to begin again. 4 years later, the morning room at Kelford had not changed, but the people in it had. The fire was lit. It was November, and the first frost had silvered the lawns overnight. Verity sat in her usual chair with her correspondence and a cup of tea with lemon. Across from her, Leander read the morning papers with the comfortable inattention of a man who has discovered that the most interesting thing in any room is usually his wife. Their son Thomas, aged 2.5 and possessed of his mother's gray eyes and his father's absolute certainty that the world existed for his convenience, was attempting to feed toast to the spaniel beneath the table. Their daughter, Patience, named for Verity's sister, who had received the honor with suspicious equanimity and immediately sent the infant a Greek lexicon, was 6 months old and asleep in the nursery, where Grieve was keeping watch with the same steady attention she had brought to everything since the morning she had sat by the window, counting to 11 and witnessing the 4 words that had rearranged a marriage. "Papa," Thomas said, surfacing from beneath the table with crumbs in his hair and the expression of a diplomat who has concluded a successful negotiation. "Why do you always let Mama decide?" Leander looked at Verity over the top of his paper. She looked at him over the rim of her teacup. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, no longer, but it contained, in the way that certain looks between certain people do, the entire compressed history of a morning room and a mantelpiece and a smile and 4 words and a man who had been at a loss and a woman who had never needed him to break. "Because," Leander said, folding his paper with the precise movements of a man who has learned that precision is a form of care, "your mother is usually right, and I have learned that this is not a deficiency in my character, but an extraordinary piece of luck." "What is luck?" "Luck," Verity said, setting down her teacup, "is finding something valuable in a place you were not looking." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a 2-year-old philosopher. Then he returned to the spaniel. The gardens at Kelford were Verity's legacy, expanded each year since that first autumn when she had planted crocuses along the south walk without telling anyone. The still room was still the best run in the county. The tenants still told the story of the water dispute, and Mr. Cathcart's son, now old enough to farm his own parcel, addressed the Duchess with the respectful familiarity of a man whose family owed its peace to a woman who had listened. Eves had retired the previous spring. His replacement, a younger man named Ward, had been trained by Verity herself and regarded her instructions with the attentive seriousness of a student who understood that his teacher's knowledge had been earned, not inherited. The letter, the one Leander had written to Sir Rowan Campion 8 months into their marriage, the one that had sat in the second drawer of his desk like an unexploded shell, had been burned. Leander had done it himself in the library fireplace on a Tuesday afternoon in their second year, and Verity had come in and seen the remains and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The letter had been written by a man who no longer existed, and the man who had replaced him did not require absolution, only the ongoing, daily, unperformed practice of deserving what he had. Mrs. Garrick, who was 67 now and moved more slowly but whose eyes missed nothing, brought fresh tea without being asked and left the morning room with the satisfied expression of a woman who has spent 34 years in service to a family and has finally, in her last decade, seen it become a household. Outside, the November light lay pale and clean across the south lawn. The robin was there, or a robin, or a descendant of robins, generations removed from the one that had sat on the balustrade on a February morning while a duke made a speech and a duchess smiled, and the whole architecture of a marriage shifted on 4 words that had cost nothing to say and everything to earn. They arrive here, like a room kept warm for someone expected, whenever they are ready.